Welcome to our web exclusive. I'm Mike Montecalvo, along with Eyewitness News analyst Lieutenant General Reginald Centracchio. A lot going on overseas, General, so we're going to start off with what's brewing in Iran. And tensions are really stirring up the pot, so to speak, right now. They're talking about nuclear advances. This is something you've been talking about for a while. They claim all of this that they've been working on is for energy. Are we finding out today that that's not the case anymore?
Well, I think certainly today we're seeing that they certainly have the capability to refine it more so than we thought previously. You know, 20% enrichment is the grade they need for a reactor for power. But anything beyond that, more refinement would clearly show us that they're attempting to refine it to weapons grade material. And if that is the case, then we need to just pay attention to this, because it's this far from being able to go from 20% to a higher grade, which gives them the capability. Well,
they're claiming they've made two major advances in the program. What's their benefit to tell the world that they've done this?
Well, I think at this point they're suggesting that this is the main reason for them to develop and enrich it for nuclear power. And anything beyond that, then they would find it very hard to be able to justify it to the rest of the world. At this juncture, they're showing and demonstrating that it is for nuclear power versus nuclear weapons. And I think that's exactly what they're trying.
So if they came out and said it's production for nuclear rods, what would you say if you were the president?
Well, I would say you need to stop it, and we're going to do something about it, either through additional meaningful sanctions that has a result to it, or a possible military strike at their facilities.
For 2 years you've talked about that sanctions don't usually work in cases like this, but this is a little bit different, right?
The particular sanction they're talking about now is targeting their ability to transact their financial wellness. Unless they have the ability to take money and put it into the mainstream, it doesn't have any effect. This particular sanction that the United States is looking at would in fact constrain their ability to be able to do business with the rest of the world.
Well, General, they're on the verge of imposing an oil embargo on military countries that retaliate against their sanctions. What would happen if that was put into place?
I think you would certainly see a military intervention on the part of the United States. We have, aircraft Abraham Lincoln in the area. We've been conducting drills and exercises in the Strait of Hormuz for several weeks now. There's been some interface between the boats in the area from Iran, shadowing our exercises. So I do think if there was an attempt to close that strait, there would be a military confrontation.
Well, you know, Joe Public would say, why is the United States getting in on this? Because it's the European countries. Why aren't they taking the lead in all of this?
Because we need to understand that the national economy is based upon world economy. If Europe is in trouble, so is the United States. And therefore our national security is tied directly to the wellness of Europe. So if we see something significant happening in Europe, it does affect us significantly.
What kind of backing would we get in Europe?
I think you'd certainly look at the countries that are involved be on our side, and certainly lend some credence to whatever sanctions we'd be able to come up with, including the Arab nations themselves, the Arab League, who don't want to see any kind of a military confrontation in the Mideast beyond what we're seeing right now.
Well, what about Russia, China?
Russia and China, you know, there's always the extreme where you have Russia and China, because of their economic ties to Iran, won't endorse the United Nations involvement, and I don't think you'd see them participating in any, certainly I don't think you'd see them participating in any kind of military action against Iran. But nevertheless, Europe really is dependent upon whether the world economy is well. So therefore China and Russia at some point would recognize they need to be a player versus somewhat of a blocking tactic to prevent Iran from seeing meaningful sanctions.
You know, General, you go back to the Persian Gulf War, and there are a lot of people, including some military people, who said that we didn't do enough back then, and that's kind of why we ended up where we are today. Yeah. What about for something like this? Would we have to cripple Iran at this point?
You certainly would. I think you'd have to take away their ability to have them have any significant impact militarily. I don't think we'd really get to that point. I think what would happen is Israel would certainly enter the net, and Israel would do what it did back in the 80s and would take out those facilities. The problem is that we've allowed them, as a world concern, to allow Iran to deepen its capability to protect its nuclear capability.
So it'd be difficult to get at, is that what you're saying?
Very difficult. But at the same time, there have been different ordinances developed in where the United States and Israel has the ability to penetrate well into the earth to take out those facilities, even though they're several thousands of feet below ground.
You know, General, it's, I don't know if it's timing or whatnot, but it's interesting. We're hearing about the defense cuts, Pentagon cuts, and we're hearing about what's going on in Iran and obviously unrest in Syria and Egypt. What would happen if, everything that you said falls into play here? The $350 billion that supposedly is going to get cut over the next 10 years. Are they going to have to relook at that?
Absolutely. I think what we're talking about is if everything was staying where we think it should be, and that is relatively world peace, where you don't have any major confrontations beyond Afghanistan, Panetta and the President have suggested that the risk that we'd be taking on is manageable. At the same time, I think they also recognize if the area in the Mideast were to expand into a confrontation involving Iran, you would see that going off the table and reinstituting exactly what we have now, if not more capability to deal with the Mideast.
Well, Senator John McCain today is blasting the president. Other Republicans are joining in too, and they're basically saying that the president is looking at this as a domestic policy and it's a priority over national security. Do you agree with that comment?
I agree with it. I think if you look at President Bush 1, he was in the same dilemma. We had just been very successful at the Gulf War. We looked at the economy of the country, and he was not reelected. I think this president is trying to position himself where he is giving priority to our economy and to the local aspects of the budget versus national security. He's not going to be able to defend that in the event that something significant starts to unfold in the Mideast. So I think you'll see a complete reversal and reinstituting the kind of forces we have and the kind of commitment we have to our military.
Well, General, if we don't get to that point, how will Rhode Island be affected by the cuts?
Rhode Island has 3 points that we need to be concerned about, and we've seen it in the past too. If there are significant cuts to the military, always the Navy War College and the Navy Education Training Command is a possibility for targeting. Certainly if there's another BRAC, meaning base realignment and closure, Quonset is always a possibility. I wouldn't think it would be high on a priority, but it's a possibility. And certainly the force structure of the Rhode Island National Guard is always a possibility too. And so you may see some further cuts. If you recall, the Rhode Island National Guard was taken down about 800 troops over the last several years. And in addition to that, the 2 submarines per year would certainly be in jeopardy with the budget cuts that Obama's talking about.
And the cuts that he's talking about, I think he's talking about a 10% cut in funding for the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Is that something that is okay to fall into play here as opposed to some of the other things you're talking about?
I think so. I think as long as we have a presence in Baghdad, as long as we have the ability to protect our embassy, which is a significant one to begin with, we can't just pull out of there totally. So I think the cuts that he's talking about are reasonable as it relates to Iraq at this particular point.
2 other things I'd like to touch upon. First of all, Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood. You look at it, 2 years ago we were on very good speaking terms with that country, and now it's there's no talking going on here.
The Arab Spring, I think, will show us in the next several years that may not be something that we should embrace. We talked about, well, isn't it wonderful that we have the uprisings against the dictators in the Mideast? And on one side of the coin, yes, that is so. But the alternative is we're seeing that there's an awful lot of influence in the Muslim Brotherhood, which will, in effect, place a theocracy in these areas, and you will see a radical Islamic state. I'm concerned about that in Egypt, as well as all the other countries that are involved in this Arab Spring, so to speak. And the more influence we see by the radical Islamists, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, we will eventually have to deal with more of the things that we're trying to fight to begin with, and you won't see any semblance of democracy in these areas.
How do we deal with all of this, and then you throw Syria into the mix where, we talked last Wednesday, and we talked about, 5,000 people, 5,000 people being killed, yep. And now that is up even higher now.
Absolutely. And when you talk about, trying to draw an analogy, if we look at Mogadishu several years ago, that was a humanitarian mission that we got involved in, and it turned pretty ugly, and that was Black Hawk Down. The same thing would possibly be true if we interject ourselves for humanitarian reasons in Syria. And if you look at what the possibilities would be, this is not the time to start changing our philosophy and our national policy in the name of humanitarian areas, because that won't work. We've seen it doesn't work, and we need to be absolutely sure that when we commit troops, it's for other than humanitarian reasons, because if you don't have United Nations backing, as we don't, it could be a travesty.
And we don't have the backing of Russia either. Their foreign minister is really blasting today the Western UN Security Council members for failure to coming up with some type of a resolution or agreement with Syria.
Well, at the same time, Russia and China were the ones that didn't back and vetoed any action by the United Nations to deal with the Syrian conflict that's going on. So one side we have them criticizing the Western aspects of the Security Council. At the same time, they're part of that, and they veto any action that was designed to try to squelch what's going on in Syria itself.
Okay, in general, one more thing closer to home. We've heard the city of Providence, the mayor talking about if he doesn't come up with some type of an agreement with the colleges and institutions in the city, and of also the pension fund, that the city could be bankrupt by July 1st. He's talking about trash collections every other week, closing parks and libraries. What does that do for public safety? Because I would assume that the police and fire would be on overtime at this point.
It's huge. You know, there's such a term as deja vu. We went through this back in the 70s when Providence was in the midst of some kind of a job action, and the garbage was piling up on the streets. And at one point they were considering using the Guard, which at the time General Holland and the governor did not want to allow the Guard to do that. So the possibility exists where you would have, you know, garbage piling up on the streets. Certainly the police and fire would be at the forefront of that. But when you get to public safety, you know, you get to make some real genuinely hard decisions. Money is driving this whole thing, and if there's no money available to have weekly garbage pickups, you might very well see a revisit to the 70s when you had garbage piling up on the streets again.
Okay, and you have a performance at the Veterans Home in Bristol Thursday?
Yes, a group that we're going to be entertaining our vets with down in Bristol tomorrow night, 6:30 and to 8:30, and it's just one of those times where you see the faces light up, because it's something they really
always enjoy that. All right, General, thank you very much for your thoughts, and thanks for watching.